Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. This week I thought I would go ahead and show you guys how to do what we call the circular arm joint. And originally I was going to do a demo this week on what we call the reach behind, which is where you want to take a character's arm and you want to move it from being in a position in front of the body to being behind the body. And I recorded that video already, but I decided that I needed to go back and show you guys the arm joint first just to make things a little bit simpler. So I'll go ahead and post the reach behind video next week, and this week we'll do the circular arm joint. So if we take a look at the scene file here, the only thing that I've done is I've prepared a little bit of artwork, which is just basically the arm. And so I don't have anything else attached to it. I don't have a hand, I don't have an upper or a sleeve or anything like that. This is just going to be my upper and lower arm. And this should be enough to show the concept of how we can do this arm joint. And so all I've done to prepare this artwork is I've got my line art layer and I've drawn my arm in there. And I do have an outline on the arm because this is kind of the worst case scenario. If you don't have an outline on your arm, it's much easier to do joints because you don't have to worry about the overlapping line art there. But in this case, let's do it with an outline so we can see why we might run into issues with the arm and the overlapping. So the first thing to do when we want to make our arm is we need to cut it into two separate pieces because we want to animate the lower arm separately from the upper arm. And you always have to remember that when you want to animate something separately with your transform tool, you're going to go ahead and make those on different drawing layers. This is different from if you're using the deform from Harmony. If you're using deform, you can leave everything on one layer. But with the sort of traditional techniques, and this is something that you can do in Animate Pro, if you're doing it in Animate, you can't quite get the same level of control that I'm going to show you today. But with Animate Pro, you can do the same thing. So let's go ahead first and cut this into two different layers. And what I'll do is I'll select my cutter tool, which is nested underneath my select tool. And the first trick I want to show you guys is when you're using your cutter tool, if you drag around the outside of the arm, but you don't drag across the artwork and you let go, what it's going to do is it's going to do a straight line between those two. So I'll just do that again and I'll do it a little bit better. And you see how you can get really a perfect cut in this case just by not sort of dragging across the artwork when you do your cut. And then you can do your Control X or Command X and you can create a new layer and you can do your Command V. If you are using the option Create Drawing from Drawing Selection, make sure that you're in the camera view because this option does not work from the drawing view. You might notice it's ghosted out when you're in the drawing view. And the reason is that Create Drawing from Drawing Selection is going to create automatically a new layer for you. And the drawing view only displays one layer at a time, so it doesn't know how to do this from the drawing view. You do have to do it from the camera. Now that I've got these, I'm going to label them just in a different way so that I can see what I'm doing. So I've got lower arm, and this one is going to be my upper arm. And now what I want to do is I want to place a circle over that arm joint that I can use to actually bend the elbow around. So I'll just go ahead and select my ellipse tool, and if I want to get the line of the ellipse to be the same width as the line that I've already drawn there for the arm, there's an easy way to do this, and that's by holding down your O shortcut, and then you can just make sure it matches exactly. It seems to match exactly in my case now, so I should be good. But you can always click and drag to adjust that. And then as you're drawing your circle, well, first of all, make sure that you have the correct color selected. So I'll just hit D for dropper and I'll select the line color there. And you want to hold down the Shift key while you're making your circle so that you get a perfect circle. It is important to have a perfect circle here. We don't want to have an ellipse. And now I can actually just use my arrow keys to kind of overlap this circle with the artwork that I have already. And I want to have it match or line up with the two lines on either side, so I can just sort of make that match as well as I can there. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but it's going to be easier for us if it is. So now that I've got this circle in here, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I copy the circle that I've created from the upper arm to the lower arm so that I have exactly the same circle on both artwork. So I can select that circle and I can do my Control C or Command C, and then I can switch over to my line or my lower arm layer and do my Control V or Command V, and then I'll have the same circle in both the lower arm and the upper arm. Now I can return to the upper arm, and what I want to do is I want to get rid of this piece of the line that is overlapping where the lighter skin tone is there. And if your line art is drawn in a good way, then you can just kind of click or drag on that with your cutter tool, and it will remove the circle, that part of the circle. But you might also want to make this a little easier for yourself, and instead of just doing it right away like that, you might want to take your circle or your ellipse, select it, and then convert from pencil to brush. And there is an operation for that in your tool properties of your select tool. Or you can get it also through your right-click menu, convert pencil to brush. And once that's been converted to a brush stroke, the cutter tool will work a little bit better with this because it's not going to be limited by that sort of outer edge there of the circle, because you know the circle is defined by a center line, or the ellipse is defined by a center line by default. And now that I've got that cut out, I can go back to my lower arm, use my D for dropper, switch back to my upper arm, and just paint that in. So now I've got the completed artwork on my upper arm. Now on the lower arm, there's an additional step that I want to do here, and it looks like somehow I ended up deleting my circle from my lower arm, so let me just go back a few steps and figure out where I did that. I think I may have had both artworks selected when I did my cutter tool, but let me just go back to my upper arm and I will select my circle again, and I'm going to copy it into my lower arm layer because I need to have the circle on both. Now I can go to my upper arm layer, make sure that I convert to brush, and then I can cut out that line art there with that. And I like to just have all the I like to have all of the fill inside be one piece, which is why I go back and delete the fill and recolor it in. But you don't have to if you don't want to. Now when we're going to the lower arm layer is the layer that the arm is going to pivot around. So before I go ahead and cut the circle in the same way I did on the upper arm, first I need to define where the pivot is on this drawing. So I can select that circle, and with the circle selected, if I go to my pivot tool, you see how it gives that bounding box with a dot in the center. And I just want to take my pivot tool and I want to put, I'm zooming all the way in, and I want to put the pivot point directly on top of where that center of that circle is. And if I just pop over to my camera view for a second and check out why I did that, if I select my lower arm now and I rotate my lower arm, it's going to rotate perfectly around the circle that I've put in the center. So this is the reason why we want to make sure that we define the pivot point properly there. Now if I go back to my drawing view, on the lower arm, what I'd like to do now is pretty much the same thing I did with the upper arm. I'll take this drawing layer here and I will convert that ellipse to a brush stroke, and then I can go back and use my cutter tool to remove that artwork, and then I can paint back in with the fill there. So in both cases you want to have the artwork completed on both sides, but you're going to delete sort of the opposite side of the circle. And when you go back and look at this from your camera view now again, and you can check out to make sure that that's going to rotate really nicely around that pivot. But clearly this isn't completely finished because you can see that I still see the line there. And what we want to do with this circle joint is we want to actually get rid of the line. And the way that we can do this very effectively in Animate Pro and Harmony is by using these sublayers that we have available here. And I always want to keep the completed artwork in one of these layers. So I'll keep the completed artwork in my line art layer. But what I'll do is I will select the completed artwork from the line art layer and I'll copy it, Control C, and then I can go to my color art layer and I can paste it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this color art layer to define the patch that I'm going to layer on top. So the only thing I need to do now is I just get rid of where that line overlaps there, and then I want to do one additional step, and I can take my my contour editor tool and I can just hit Control to add a couple of control points, or you can see where the control points are there right now, and then I can just kind of drag it over like this, and that's going to get rid of the line, or make the line kind of a sharp point, because we want to define a nice crease around where that elbow is. And if you've got a lot of extra points here, then you can delete some of those points to get it looking nicer. And I'll just do the same thing on this side. So it looks like I have a little extra piece there from the top, so I can delete that piece if I want to, and go back to my contour editor, and then I can add a contour point here on the line, and then I can just drag that over and that's going to create a really nice line there for me. So then I can get rid of this extra piece there. So what I have in the end when I look at my artwork is on my lower arm layer, which is the layer that is going to be sort of on top when I rotate the arm, I have in my line art the completed artwork, and then I have in my color art this artwork that is almost complete but is missing the end on that line, and then you can just make a really nice crease there. Now if I go back to my camera view, of course at this point I'm still not seeing what I want to see, and the reason is because I need to define how I want those layers to overlap. So we do this now in Animate Pro and Harmony through our network view, and I can check out where my upper arm and my lower arm are with relation to my composite, and it looks like I have an extra composite there. I can just delete that one. And so I can see that my upper arm right now is underneath the lower arm. Remember that things that show up on the left are going to be on top. And so what I'll do is I'll just slide the lower arm underneath the upper arm. And then what I can do is I can just take this lower arm layer here and I can copy and paste it. And when you copy and paste it in the network view, it creates a clone of that layer. And clones will share the same exposure. So when you are animating this thing, you don't have to animate both clones separately. You can animate them as one. But when you connect both of them to your composite, then it allows you to do some special things. Like I can take the clone and I can go inside the layer properties by clicking on the yellow options box. And then in my drawing layer properties, I can tell it not to show me the line art on that layer. And I can turn off all the ones except color art, because pretty much color art is the only one I'm going to be using here. And now when you take this layer and you rotate the layer, then you can see that it is going to have a really nice crease when you rotate that one. Now when we're working in Animate Pro and Harmony, usually we recommend that people work with peg layers, and what that means, and actually I can do this from my timeline if I want, and so I can just add a peg layer by clicking on the Add Peg button, and it will even name it appropriately. And then I can connect that to both of those clones. And now if I use that peg layer to rotate the arm, it's not quite going to rotate properly because I need it to rotate from the same pivot that I defined on that drawing layer. So if you go inside your drawing layer's layer properties one more time, then in here you can see Use Embedded Pivots, and you can apply the embedded pivot on the parent peg. And what this is going to do now is it's going to allow me to rotate the parent peg, which is this one right here, using the pivot that I already defined on the lower arm layer. So this is one way of doing things. I mean, with compositing, the really cool thing about having the compositing directly in here is that there are multiple ways of doing things. I showed you how to do it with a clone, but there's also another way that I'll show you very rapidly. I will just get rid of that copy of the lower arm that's going in there, and I'll go back in here and apply the embedded pivot on parent peg for that original arm. So in this case, another thing that I could do, just to show you rapidly, is I could go into my lower arm layer, and if I go into the filter tab, I can use the filter tab just to filter out the color art of that layer. And then if I do that, I can stick the color art on top, and once again if I rotate from the peg layer, it's going to rotate both of those drawing layers. In this case, since I didn't use a clone, I can also rotate directly from the drawing layer. And there's no particular advantage or disadvantage to using a clone or to using a filter. The only difference is that I think that sometimes the network view can get a little convoluted if you have a lot of pipes going into these filters. But the advantage of doing it with the filter is you can animate directly from the drawing layer as well if you want to. So it's kind of a personal preference thing. And the last thing that I'll just mention is if you are animating on peg layers only, you can also turn off, if you go inside your Advanced tab in your layer properties, you can turn off Animate using animation tools. And what that will do is it will prevent me from being able to animate on the drawing layer. Whenever you will rotate something, you see that I'm rotating on the arm layer. I have the arm layer selected, but it's putting the keyframe on the peg layer. And so that's just something to be aware of that can make your life easier if you are animating with pegs. Another thing that can make your life easier when you're animating with pegs is if you go to your Transform Tool layer properties, you'll see that there is a layer property in here that says Peg Selection Mode. And when you click this on, what happens is when you click on a drawing, it selects the peg instead of selecting the drawing. And this way you know that you're going to put the keyframe on the peg layer and not on the drawing layer. So that's all I wanted to show you this week. That is how to create the circular arm joint. So the important thing is, if you're going into your your drawing view and you're checking out what the layers look like, you'll have your upper arm layer that has the completed artwork, and then you'll have your lower arm layer that has the completed artwork in the line art, and then in your color art layer you can put the completed artwork but minus the end. And you might wonder, well, why don't I just use this one? Instead of using both the line art and the color art, why don't I just use the color art? And let me show you this. If I take away that line art layer from underneath, if I rotate this to a certain degree, if I rotate it far enough, then you start to see little bits and pieces that will show up, like little gaps. And those gaps, you might not care about those gaps, but if you do care about things looking perfect, then those gaps aren't very pretty. And if you have the completed artwork layered underneath it, you see how it fills that gap in. If you're using Animate, it's a little bit harder to get this system working where you can have the one on top and the one underneath. So in that case, you can go ahead and just do the patch without having the layer underneath. And you can still get a pretty good looking arm, particularly if you use a circle for the joint. It really also just depends on the shape of the arm. Sometimes the gaps show up more depending on what shape the arm looks like. So that's it for this week. Really simple, easy, how to do a circular arm joint. I know I went through that really fast, so I recommend that you try it out. It's a very effective way of doing joints on cutout characters. And then next week I'll show you how we can take this a step further and create an arm that we can do the reach behind on, so that you can switch the arm from being in front of the body to being behind the body. Thanks, see you next week.